So I'm going to install essentially Active Directory. This is going to go on Alice. So the first step is to install Samba and Samba DC, and these applications are the ones that will be doing all the work. So it doesn't take very long. We do a bit of configuration, i.e. we remove the configuration file for Samba, and then we create a new provisioning state for it. So I'm going to give it a name, Zen Tokidoki, because if I ever set up a company, that's what I'm going to call it. And after that, we pretty much accept all the defaults that come through. There's nothing particularly exciting in this lot. And obviously I can't type passwords. And there we go, we're done. So that's now installed. Quick bit of additional configuration. Again, as previously done, I've just followed the instructions on server world, which I'll link below. So the final step is to enable Samba, and then that's just going to be running all the time now on this server. So we'll just check the configuration to make sure it's doing what we think it's doing. And there we can see that we're running a Windows 2008 domain. And that service is now up and running, which is great. First thing we're going to do is create a new user on the domain, and we can call it Oaf. I'm going to try doing it under sudo, because that's always something I forget to do. And then I'm going to try and think about a password that actually meets the complexity criteria. I'm sorry, it's just hilarious. The next step is we set up the firewall, and we do this firstly by adding all the services that are involved in domain controlling as such. And the next step is correcting the fact that I can't type, or that I don't know how to use the command. Next up, we add the ports that the domain controller actually needs to function, which are pretty much all of them by the looks of this. And there we go. And in theory, at least, that should be running once we restart the firewall. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to have a list of the users on the domain, just as a test, and we can see that Oaf's there, and there are a couple of other ones which we're probably not going to be using anytime soon. I'm also going to have a quick look at all the groups, because group membership is obviously how you administer domains. And we can see a shed load of groups there that are pretty much in line with what you'd expect with a Windows domain. So I reckon what I want to do now is add a group of my own, and this will be the group of users that will have access to the resources on the network, not access to necessarily to administer the network, but certainly to access files, web servers, or any other services that I decide to set up. So I've added a group called Tokidoki users, and I'm going to add Mr. Oaf to that group. While I'm at it, I'm also going to add Mr. Oaf to the Enterprise Admin group. And the reason for this is because Mr. Oaf is going to be the Enterprise Administrator. Now normally you probably wouldn't use the Enterprise Administrator for everything in terms of administration, but I am going to because it's such a small network. Now I'm also going to want to add another user who isn't an enterprise admin in order to just use the computers. And again, you really shouldn't have your main account as the domain administrator. You should keep the account separate. And Steve's just going to be a user on the network. I will also add Steve to the Tokidoki users because he will be using the services on the network. And I think that's about where I'm going to leave the configuration for now. And we're going to move on to trying to add a computer to the domain. So we're on my Windows laptop. We open up the properties window for the computer, and we just pop into the system properties and change the domain. And all we do is type the name in the box. And in theory, if I've set it up right, that will work. We need to authenticate against the enterprise administrator that we've just created, although obviously you could create different accounts or even just give permissions to anybody to do this sort of thing, but I'm leaving it as the administrator for the domain, yeah, or enterprise. And that didn't work. Oh. So I've done something wrong. So that didn't work. I confess I had to give it a serious coat of thinking about at that point. And there were basically two things that I was doing wrong. The first one's pretty straightforward. I just wasn't following the instructions. And the instructions stated that one needed to set up the DNS server to be the DNS server on the client computer, that is, to be the domain controller, or the Samba server in this case. Can't say I'm overly chuffed with that. I'm going to have to look in the future at automating that so that it's done through DHCP or something. But yes, that was the easy problem to resolve. For the next problem that I encountered, really got to talk about the way Linux protects the system from malfeasance, as it were. So you have sort of protections at the application layer where you set who can have access to the application. The prime example of this would be something like SQL Server or MySQL Server or Maria database, which you set up users in that account. And again, with the domain controller, I've set up the Oaf account to be the god emperor, and that's okay. So that bit works all right. At the hardware end, you've got the way the network's set up. Now I know the network works because I can SSH to it, so it's on the network. We know it was working, which leaves the usual two culprits. The first one is SE Linux. Now SE Linux is a very useful tool in that it only allows certain services access to certain resources. Sometimes the applications that you're running don't support SE Linux, and then or you have a slightly more complicated system, and when that happens it gets very troublesome to sort out the problem sometimes. And the other security, shall we say, that tends to break things is the firewall. Now you saw me in the previous clip when I was setting it all up, messing around with the firewall, adding ports, adding services, and that should have worked. But it didn't. So I've turned the firewall off and it works perfectly. So at the moment I'm going to call that a win, and I'll have to come and revisit the firewall at some point and try and figure out exactly which ports I need to open that I haven't already opened in order for Samba directory services to be contactable by random computers on the network. So once we've made the necessary changes, we go back and do the same thing again, and then we can log on. So this is me logged onto my Windows computer, and you get the default sort of Catalyst video driver rubbish running. You can see they've got no documents in the recents, and there's no documents in the documents. It's like a new logged on user. Glorious, isn't it? And again, the web browser is all clear and happy. And that says it all, really. The next step after that was to see about adding it on the domain using a Mac. In this case you have to go into the directory services, applet in control panel, and basically type in the name of the domain server. Sorry, the name of the domain even. I'm just looking at the administration settings. They seem reasonable to me. I am going to give it the preferred domain server just because it cuts it out looking for it, I suppose. And I want to make sure that the domain admins and enterprise admins can administer the Mac. I'm going to give the computer a different name because admins iMac sounds rubbish, doesn't it? So it's going to be Miyuka. Why not? And press the bind button and it asks for authentication. And we'll use our Oaf account for that. And it didn't work. Of course we know why it didn't work, because I haven't been messing around with the DNS settings on this computer yet. And here we go. So we're going to change the default from the gateway to the DNS from the gateway to the domain controller, and then we'll add in the gateway again in case the domain controller stops working for some reason. So at least we can get on the internet. And if we then bind it, again, a bit more authentication on the domain. And that's basically it. And we're in. come out of that. We can go and have a look at the user settings. And we can see under logon options that our domain server is called Zenzen, which is great. We've got one last thing we need to do, and that is change. And here we can see we're logged in. We've lost the black screen. We've got the default High Sierra wallpaper. I think it's High Sierra. And we can go into the control panel, and that looks a bit weird. I'm going to change the picture on it, but I've got to do some work somewhere on Active Directory to give accounts proper names, full names, etc. And that will form part of a later video, I suspect.